I've always said that it's not about the technology, it's about answering a need. And so if no one finds a reason to use this technology, then maybe it just doesn't address a need that is of importance right now. I mean, we can always hope that the industry will want to use technologies that bring this transparency, integrity, and so on. But if there's not an actual need that's identified, that's burning right now, for this, then the technology is just not going to get the traction that it deserves or that it needs. So I don't want to be the person who says, oh, we should really adopt blockchain. It's such a great technology and so on. I've been that person in the past and it hasn't really changed the conversation. But I think we should really focus, maybe first of all, on understanding better why is it that we're not aiming to use this technology? What is it about the fact that so if we just look at use cases, not talking about the technology, if we look at simple things like, one of the value propositions of blockchain was we should give patients more control over their health data, the way that it's used, who uses it, for what reason, and so on.
Hello, Anca, and welcome to Impulse. I'm glad to have you on the show for what will be actually the second episode of this series where we talk about, Web3 and its applications in healthcare. We did basically 3 years ago an episode, that was episode 10, that we recorded with Eberhard Troyer from the D-Health Foundation. So actually in the first season of the podcast back in 2022. I think it's still, a great entry point, I think, for our listeners who might have never heard about the topic and why it's relevant for healthcare. So, if you want to have a better understanding of the technology behind Web3, the applications, and, the hopes it fostered within healthcare at the time, I strongly encourage you to, have a listen to it. I think it will nicely complement the conversation we'll have today. And we also, I don't think we'll cover again the basics. So I'll redirect you guys to that one as well. We're now recording in August 2025, so more than 3 years later, and I'm sure that many things have changed or evolved in the meantime. So I'm counting on you, Anka, for getting us up to speed and taking us through what worked, what hasn't worked, and also what were the new opportunities or the applications that came up over the past 3 years, and what we might expect for the years to come as well. So with that, and before we start diving into this space again, I would invite you, Anka, to present yourself.
Absolutely. Well, thank you, first of all, so much for having me. It's a pleasure to come after the episode with Eberhard. Eberhard is quite a veteran of this field, so that's a lot of pressure on me to keep you guys up to date with what's going on in the Web3 space. I've been in this space for the past 8 years now, I believe. I'm a pharmacist by training, and I've sort of discovered the field of Web3 initially through blockchain 8, 9 years ago. I thought it was absolutely fascinating. It was at the time where blockchain was a bit of a buzzword. It was starting to buzz. Everyone knew about Bitcoin. There was a big crypto craze going on. And that's sort of the period when I entered the Web3 space. It wasn't really called Web3 back then. We didn't really use that term. We talked about blockchain and we ended up calling it Web3. But that's how I discovered it, through someone who introduced me to the field through the lens of crypto. And studying pharmacy myself, I thought it was really interesting to try to connect the dots and see how this field of blockchain and crypto could relate to healthcare and have an impact in the healthcare industry. So this is how I started 8 years ago. Ever since, I've been hosting a podcast. I have a community of people interested in Web3. Nowadays, we do talk a lot about Web3 and AI. The podcast is called Tech Anatomy. And we keep the conversation going, a bit like what you're doing with Impulse. And besides that, I also have a company called Magic Studio where we create our own podcasts for other people who are looking to do similar things.
Super cool. And I'll recommend also the listeners to check out, the not only like Tech Anatomy, which was or formerly called, Into the Meta Health, but also, yeah, your work with MedCheck Studio and what you do with Marguerite. We've had the chance to work together in the past. So yeah, I can highly recommend your services. So, back in the time where we did the episode with Eberhard, I think the focus we had during the conversation was, some basics about what Web3 means, but it was also applications around, drug traceability and, patient data ownership. From your perspective in 2025, how do you think this has evolved in terms of applications? What have you seen, in the space, and what are like some of the current applications that, are really, let's say, changing care practices or really got like traction into healthcare?
So I think that the use cases per se have been the same ever since we started identifying them and working around them 5, 6, 7 years ago. The main use cases that we always describe around Web3, and now I'll be specific more to blockchain, are the use cases around data integrity, traceability, and anything that has to do with proving that something happened at a moment in time and making sure that that information stays the same over time, that no one can alter that information. That value proposition is still very much the same. That's what the technology does, it hasn't changed. What has changed is more the view that we have and the sort of media circus that happens around the technology. And so the value proposition and the use cases are still pretty much the same. It's just that we don't really talk about them so much anymore. And a lot of the proof of concepts and the experimentations that happened in the past, they never really went into production and implementation at a large scale. Those who did are very confidential. People don't really talk about them. And a lot of people who are using blockchain and distributed ledger technologies as a whole don't really mention it anymore. It's not something that sells, let's say. So it's not something that people will advertise saying, oh, we are a blockchain solution or blockchain company or whatever. They are going to say, we are here to protect, ensure the integrity of your data, ensure the traceability of your products. And it happens that we're using blockchain if you're asking. But if you're not asking, we're not going to tell you. So the use cases are still pretty much the same. It's just really the whole speech around it that has changed lately.
hmm And so, do you think this is due to, or what is your interpretation? Why is this not more, let's say, broadly communicated? Is it linked to what happened? So, basically, in the year where we recorded the first episode in 2022, there was like a whole, let's say, what people call like this crypto winter, where there was a lot of like downturns in terms of on the crypto market. There were, I think, many industry, like in the industry as well, there were a lot of like scandals and blah blah blah. Do you think it's related to that? It's kind of like in the aftermath and in the rebuilding of that phase that, these actors changed the way they would communicate about the technology and, specifically as well, its applications in healthcare. Do you think there is like a trust element that's there?
I think that this is something that I've been trying to figure out for the past maybe 3 or 4 years, ever since we started not talking about it so much. It's really hard to pinpoint what exactly it is. So we kind of made different hypotheses. The first one was, as you said, it is linked to the crypto winter. So because the crypto field is not doing well, then there's less interest in everything blockchain related. That first hypothesis, I don't believe it to be true because for the past year, we've had a surge in the crypto world. We're seeing a very bullish market and everything seems to be going quite well. But that doesn't mean that we have new projects coming into the blockchain and healthcare space. The blockchain and healthcare space is still incredibly silent, independently of anything that happens in the crypto world. I don't believe these two fields are connected. Maybe for some companies that have gone through ICOs and that have a token and that are very much linked to the crypto community, it could have an impact. But in the larger healthcare industry, the traditional healthcare industry, they don't really care what's going on in the crypto market. They really dissociate the two components, the crypto and the technology, which is the blockchain technology. So I don't think it's linked. So that leaves us to with then what is it? What's the reason? Um, we work a lot with the pharmaceutical industry, so what I say is really from that standpoint. The pharmaceutical industry was really interested in blockchain a couple of years ago, especially when it comes to tracing products, making sure that we're fighting against counterfeit products and so on. Also, making sure that data from clinical trials is traceable and that there's no problem there. And those were all use cases that they thought were really interested, and they really try to create projects and experiments and so on. But what ended up happening is that these companies didn't go all the way to an actual solution or product or project. What happened was that they ended up investing in something else because what blockchain really brings is integrity, it's transparency, it's traceability. And those are things that are very hard to quantify from a return on investment standpoint.
Mhm, mhm.
So, if we're to invest money in such projects, what is it that we're actually gaining? More traceability, more transparency? Sure, but what exactly does that mean to us? And what happened is that it was so hard to quantify what exactly it was that it was bringing to these companies that they ended up not pursuing the projects. And those projects were actually pursued by third parties, like vendors and software providers and other type of tech and IT and those type of companies. And now what we see is that those companies are creating pieces of software that integrate blockchain technology. Again, they don't really advertise it anymore. It's just part of the stack. And then those companies sell these solutions and those products to traditional healthcare companies, mostly hospitals, institutions. I don't see a lot of it going to the pharmaceutical industry. I could be mistaken. I think it's very minimal, but the projects are really driven now by tech IT companies that are integrating it into their softwares rather than by traditional healthcare companies and institutions and so on.
And so these third parties are the ones driving the, let's say, the evidence around the benefits of, using that technology for transparency, for traceability, for integrity of, healthcare data. How do you see it? Like, is it because, yeah, I'm wondering if it's, I mean, knowing a bit the field, I have the impression like the pharma companies or like healthcare actors, they like to generate that evidence themselves. So I'm wondering like if they are actually sensible to what these third parties are kind of like, now bringing to the table in terms of, okay, these are the benefits you might withdraw from that technology. But yeah.
Well, first of all, I don't see a lot of them actually selling to
Yeah.
pharmaceutical companies, so I don't think they're really making an argument around that. Those that I see are, for instance, selling to, let's say, healthcare facilities. And they go, so we have a software, and the idea of the software is that it will help you manage consent forms digitally for all the patients that are involved in clinical trials in your hospital because you have to collect the data, you have to store the data, make sure that it's tamper proof, etc., etc. And our software does that. So this is what we're selling. And the fact that it uses a blockchain sort of comes into the argument of this is tamper proof, this is secure, this is
Yeah.
whatever. But just as you don't explain what the other technologies are that you're using in your software, you don't go into that much detail, except if you're actually talking to someone who's interested in that. But you wouldn't necessarily state it from the get go.
Mhm.
You don't really state that you're using blockchain from the get go either. It's just part of the technical stuff that makes your software or your solution.
Yeah. And I'm actually curious, maybe like on the healthcare professional or the patient side, like, do you have any let's say thoughts on what's their thinking about benefiting from a solution that might be relying on blockchain? Or like, I'm always thinking a bit, and that's what I think we also discussed with Eberhard in that in episode 10, like what is a bit the user experience from an HCP perspective, from a patient perspective for these types of solutions? And again, to your points, maybe they might not even see it these days. So, because I guess it's probably different than what you see in the cryptocurrency space.
Yeah.
So,
So I think that there might be some people that are familiar with crypto within the healthcare industry. That is absolutely not the majority of people. The
Mhm.
people we talk to, mainly, as I said, in pharma or healthcare facilities, they have no clue how these things work. They've heard of Bitcoin, but that's pretty much it. So, in order for it to work, if you're using some blockchain in your software or your solution, it has to look like what people are used to. It cannot look any different. Otherwise, you're going to have an onboarding period that's just crazy long and will require a lot of explanation. And if we take the example of patients who are involved in a clinical trial in a hospital, those are people that have better things to do than learn how to use a crypto wallet to store
Yeah, yeah.
their, identification and
Credentials.
whatnot. So you really have to make it smooth. It really has to come down to, email address and password. If you have to log into something, even if it's blockchain based, it has to be really simple. So I think that a lot of the companies that I see have given up on the whole token wallet system, and they're really using the technology as sort of an audit trail on steroids, a very powerful way of tracking data, but without letting it really get to the patient in terms of user experience and keeping the patient as far away as possible from all that. If it's an patient-facing application. If it's not, then I don't really know how they manage it. Maybe they have some wallet system, but for knowledgeable people. But I think that today, if I were to launch a solution that's blockchain-based, first of all, I'll probably not talk about it, not advertise it. And second of all, I would try to make it as normal as possible for the end user because it's already challenging to have someone adopt our solution. So you shouldn't need a manual to understand how
Mhm.
to use it and how to connect to that solution.
Yeah. And I mean, in a way, this is also showing that this is maybe, or my interpretation would be that this is getting, commoditized to some degree, or, the fact that people are not talking or putting it out loud that, in the background, there's, we're using this type of blockchain, blah, blah, blah. It just shows that maybe, in the end, it doesn't matter if it does, from an infrastructure and from a data integrity perspective, does the job. Yeah, maybe like, I guess, patients or healthcare professionals or administrators and so on do not care that much, what's actually behind that the solutions. Um,
But it's really, I kind of have like two different ways of saying things. On one side, like I have to be pragmatic. It's not taking off. It's not driving interest. It's not driving investments. It's not living up to the promise that was set 8 years ago. It's just not. Otherwise, we would all know about it and it would be, ChatGPT. We all know about it. It's not happening. But at the same time, I kind of have a hard time giving up on it because the value proposition is interesting, is a strong one, is one that we should be aiming for in healthcare. Would you tell me that you don't want a healthcare system that's more transparent, that ensures data integrity, that allows patients more control over their data? No one would say that. We're all aiming towards that. But between what we're aiming for and what we're ready to do today to invest into the technology that could take us there, that's a huge gap. I don't know how we can bridge that gap, but the gap is very much real today.
mhm, mhm. Yeah, I was also thinking, I mean, you mentioned ChatGPT, like artificial intelligence, that was kind of like the new trendy thing that maybe came up right after the whole crypto thing and blockchain. Um, do you have any thoughts to share in terms of how like artificial intelligence and Web3 kind of like intertwine and how they might have or could, benefit healthcare in general?
So I think that first of all, we need to redefine what we mean when we talk about Web3, because if we solely live it around blockchain, then we're missing out on a lot of different things. I think that today, when we talk about Web3, there are a lot of things that are encompassed. Um, of course, the foundational one being blockchain, but there have been a lot of applications for a larger audience that have emerged based on blockchain and that are now entering into this Web3 field. Things like, virtual environments and metaverses. Those are part of this larger term that is Web3. The same with ways of gamifying property and loyalty programs, things like NFTs and things like that. So the Web3 space is really changing, and it's integrating a lot of different things that are not necessarily blockchain. And so when we talk about Web3 and AI, the idea is to see how do these two massive things, because AI is its own world. So how do these two very massive worlds integrate with one another? And for the longest time, they have been opposed simply because AI appeared in the media and took over the Web3 environment. And so everyone was like, oh, this competition, AI is, crushing Web3 and so on. The reality is that those are two very complementary things. One is about, and namely AI, is about using large volumes of data in healthcare, for instance, to predict stuff, to generate stuff, to make sense of data that's impossible to make sense as a human. And the other one is about tracking transparency and integrity. So they really have nothing to do with one another, and it would be really weird and silly to think that they're competing when they're actually about two very different things. So a lot of the, well, not a lot, some of the projects that we're seeing at the intersection of these two worlds are about, using Web3 and blockchain specifically to ensure the transparency and the integrity of data that you're using over time. Try to tackle also the sort of black box effect of AI and bringing more transparency to what's actually the data and how are these models working. And then AI is just coming on top of that as sort of the engine and the machine that makes sense out of all this data. So they're very complementary, and I don't really see them, in a confrontational position.
Yeah, and are there like particular applications in healthcare in that regard that you would like to share with us? Because I guess from a conceptual perspective, that resonates with me. Just wondering if there is like certain health systems that have or have are using actually that combination.
So there's one that I've heard of a couple of months ago from someone that I was actually going to recommend to come on your show. His name is Jim Nasser. He's the founder of ACORE, and he was formerly at the CDC in the US, so the Center for Disease Control. And he was, I think, a software architect, but very heavily involved in the CDC. And he, with his company, they've created something, and I'm gonna give you like a very basic understanding. I'm not gonna get into details because I don't know very well. But from my understanding, it's an artificial intelligence that can generate medical information. I believe it's in the field of oncology. The problem that we have today with AI is that it has a lot of hallucinations. So, a lot of the data that is produced as you go into the conversation is starting to go farther and further from the original information that you provided or the original data. It starts hallucinating more and more. And so, his system uses some blockchain traceability to make sure that the information that is generated by AI is linked to the original one to sort of have this traceability of the information that is provided and making sure that it's still coherent and reliable versus the original information that was given. And that if hallucinations happen, they're tracked and they're identified. Maybe this is a very silly description of the solution, but this is how I understood it. So it comes back to what I said about the fact that they work in very complementary ways. One is here to ensure integrity and traceability, and one is here to generate and make sense of data. And I think this is like a good example of how they could work together.
Mhm, mhm.
You should have him on the show. He'll explain so much better.
I'll try to have it then. You mentioned, Anka, that you were saying, in terms of how the health systems in general are set up, where investments are going, like there seems to be a lot of barriers for, let's say, broad adoption and scaling up, these like blockchain solutions or Web3 related solutions in healthcare and in health systems. Um, if you could, let's say, um, put like a word on which are like you know, how would you address those points from, let's say, a regulatory or technology or, a commercial perspective? Like, do you know, like, if you would have like a magic wand, what would need to be there in the first place so that there is like a change? Or you think it's much more
Well,
complicated than that? Yeah.
I do think that we're lacking incentive. I mean, if no one is doing it, is because no one finds a good reason to do it. Because the return on investment is not there, because there is no regulatory enforcement or anything like that. I remember it was at the very beginning of me working in this field, so 8 years ago, one of the first companies that emerged in this field, they were doing something similar to what I was describing, where they gathered, I think it was some work around consents in clinical trials and empowering patients to give their consent over the use of their health data in a clinical trial context, something like that. And I remember the founder of that company saying that he believes that his company could have massive success on one single condition, and that condition didn't happen. So the company's not there anymore. Spoiler. Um, that condition was that regulatory authorities, such as the FDA or the EMA, would make it compulsory for pharmaceutical companies to track everything that's going on in a clinical trial through a blockchain that's auditable and that can be used as proof during the audits and things like that. And for him, that was the only way for the pharmaceutical industry and the healthcare industry to actually adopt this technology, was if it was, just they had to use it. It was compulsory. It was part of the process of submitting and for to the FDA or the EMA. You had to do it through a blockchain. And if they didn't have that, I don't even know if I can call it an incentive, but that requirement, they wouldn't do it, because what's the return on investment of transparency, right? So long story short, that never happened. The FDA never said that in order to conduct clinical trials, now you need to use a blockchain to track the data. So his company ended up closing, but I thought that was, sort of very pragmatic way of approaching things when he launched his business.
Yeah, and I mean, in the end, it's also very, I would say it resonates as well with many other companies, be it like in, medtech or also in digital health, pushing, let's say, digital therapeutics or many other things that we actually discussed on the podcast. Like you are depending, or as a company, you are depending on systemic changes. Like, for
Yeah.
example, reimbursement of these solutions, which take time to be understood. And again, back to the return on investment aspect, hard to demonstrate. And as long as you don't have those systemic changes being made, it's really hard to build like a long-term business that's working. You're depending on like maybe innovation grants or like, money pots here and there, but it's tricky. So I would say like by extension, this is probably also what other yeah, let's say health tech startups are struggling with, that might not be exactly in this space.
Yeah, but usually it's the other way around, right? We are so regulatory frameworks are sort of a barrier to adoption of technology. Here, we're in a situation where we wish for regulatory frameworks to help us promote the use of this technology. So it's a bit different, you know? We have a lot of regulation where we don't want it, not enough where we actually want it.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So, you mentioned at the beginning that in the end, let's say the use cases haven't changed so much, since the well, let's say the inception of or the emergence of like Web3 in healthcare, and most of it rely or goes around, ensuring transparency, integrity, and traceability of healthcare information and data. Um, I wanted to ask you, like, because you also shared, let's say the struggles or the barriers that are being faced, and also why we might also hear about it less. Um, what would be like or what would you like to see, let's say, in the next 5 years in terms of development in this space? Where I know you're, following all of this very closely and you're very attached to the topic. So if you had some, yeah, inspiration or some wishes in terms of how this should go, what would you like to see? Maybe it's like, maybe changes at the regulatory level, as we discussed, or maybe something different.
Well, it's always very hard for me to answer this question because I feel like, a spoiled kid when I have to say, what exactly do I want for blockchain
Mhm.
adoption in healthcare? Because I think that the conversation has to go past this. I've always said that it's not about the technology, it's about answering a need. And so if no one finds a reason to use this technology, then maybe it just doesn't address a need that is of importance right now. I mean, we can always hope that the industry will want to use technologies that bring this transparency, integrity, and so on. But if there's not an actual need that's identified, that's burning right now for this, then the technology is just not going to get the traction that it deserves or that it needs. So I don't want to be the person who says, oh, we should really adopt blockchain. It's such a great
Mhm.
technology and so on. I've been that person in the past, and it hasn't really changed the conversation. But I think we should really focus, maybe first of all, on understanding better why is it that we're not aiming to use this technology. What is it about the fact that, so if we just look at use cases, not talking about the technology, if we look at simple things like, one of the value propositions of blockchain was we should give patients more control over their health data, the way that it's used, who uses it, for what reason, and so on. Some countries are now developing these online patient portals where patients have their health data aggregated in one place, and it's really great. So one could ask, okay, fine, that's a first step, but why didn't you use blockchain to do it? That would increase the ownership of patients and the transparency and so on. Why didn't they use blockchain? Well, it's really simple. If patients put their trust in whoever manages the systems, whether it is a private company or public companies or just institutions in general, then there's absolutely no need whatsoever to use a blockchain to manage this data. If you trust the central party that is managing it, then you don't need a decentralized system. If you don't trust the whoever is managing it, then you might consider decentralized system. So it's not really what do I like. If I am to advocate for the use of blockchain, that means that I'm advocating for not placing trust in single entities and third parties to manage our healthcare, manage our data, manage anything related to our healthcare industry. That'd be terrifying to live in such a system. So there are use cases where you cannot trust a single party to manage something and you might need blockchain. The reality is that today, at least in country where I live in France, we do trust those companies and those public institutions to manage to some extent our data and our healthcare system. So we don't see a burning need for to use blockchain technology. So really it's a hard question to answer. What exactly is it that I want or need, or what magic wand would I want in the future for the adoption of blockchain? I think that fundamentally, if it helps, bring better care, more affordable care, anything like that, then sure, that's great. If it doesn't, I mean, we should focus on other things.
Mhm, mhm. Yeah, understood. I also saw, when I was preparing the episode, I saw one of the things that I think we didn't discuss with Eberhard and not in this episode also so far, which has probably more to do with say clinical trials or research and development of new treatments. And that's what's called, decentralized science. Can you tell us a bit more about that and what's the or yeah, how it relates currently to let's say, yeah, healthcare in general and what's happening there.
So that one is a field that I'm actually very excited about, contrary to blockchain use in the broader healthcare industry. I think decentralized science is a topic that and an area that is very much misunderstood and again very much associated to the whole crypto craze and so on. But it actually, I believe, provides real value, and I've seen this happening again and again. So there's actual proof of it. Where so people working in DeSci started from the idea that traditional science is flawed for a bunch of different reasons. Among these reasons is the fact that in research, you basically have a period of time between what we call fundamental research, where you're basically in your lab, and the development of a drug, let's say. You have a period of time where it's just pure research and you need funding for that. And usually you go for grants, and this is how you get your funding. But it's called the Valley of Death because it's really a period of time in which you really struggle because you're not at the very early stages where with very little money, you can start your research. And you're not at a phase where it's interesting to, venture capitals and so on because you don't really have proof of anything already. So it's that period of time that you need money, but you don't really have proof of anything. So it's a tricky period of time. In addition to that, your listeners might be familiar with this, but in research, everything is very well kept behind paywalls. If you've ever tried to research for scientific papers online, more often than not, you are facing, these paywalls where everything has to be paid in order to access. So as open as we want science to be, it's actually not that open. And there's a whole reviewing process for authors to get their work published in journals and so on. So it's very difficult, it's very flawed, it's lacking money, etc. So a bunch of people said, okay, so if through the traditional system we cannot get funding, we cannot get our research published, we cannot even access the research of other people, maybe we should find another way of doing things. Why not just ask the community, the people that are interested in this field? Because if your research, let's say that you're researching something around a rare disease, and there's no one to pay for your research and help you out, but there are a lot of people out there, just regular people like you and I, who are actually interested in your research. Maybe they can help. Maybe they can help you fund your research. Maybe they have skills that can help you in your project. And so the whole idea was to say, if we don't find traction in traditional science, maybe we can find traction in the general population and people who are interested in that. And so they created these communities of people who come together, and they're called DAOs, decentralized autonomous organizations, where it's just a community of people that each have roles and they support research. And basically what they do is that whatever comes of that out of that research, namely intellectual property, is then sold or licensed or whatever, and the funds are reinjected into the community to help other projects grow. And so it's really a community driven way of doing research. It doesn't replace traditional science in any way, but is just an alternative for people who are looking into specific projects or things that can really drive communities and public interest.
And in the context of let's say healthcare research, do you have some examples there? Or because I
Yeah,
guess I mean this applies to any field of science, right?
absolutely. Any type of field of science. So we've interviewed quite a few of these DAOs in the podcast last year. We're actually co-founders of DeSci Nordics, which is the DeSci community of the Nordics. And we've hosted DeSci Track just a couple of months ago in Stockholm. So we've seen a lot of these players coming here. And one of the projects that are really interesting is one that's called Vita DAO. It's perhaps the most well known in this space, where it's a community of people working around longevity.
Mhm.
And they've raised, I think it's a few millions by now that they've injected into different projects that they are funding. So the community has raised this money and then injecting it into different research projects around longevity that can then develop, create IP, and so on. So it's really interesting. I think they also received funding from Pfizer a couple of years ago. So they're starting to connect with traditional healthcare, and so they are around longevity. Then there's others around women's health, around hair growth. I think that's hair Dow, around neuroscience, climate change. There's a bunch of them that in different areas. Anything that can, where people might say, oh, I have a problem linked to that too. So I might want to get involved. There's a DAO for it.
Interesting. And is this is completely then, or that research is led like outside, let's say, traditional institutions, so universities or like these large, I mean, the context of healthcare. And like, I'm wondering, like, if, yeah, how in practice this is done, right? It's just like a bunch of people who recruit people for the research projects through these communities.
Yeah. Well, it actually, in terms of practicalities, it still happens the same traditional way. I mean, a science experiment is a science experiment. You still use the same tools and material and lab things and etc. It's just that the way that you're funded is through this
Yeah.
decentralized way, and the way that your project evolves is you're not just yourself with your team and your lab. It's you and that whole community. And
Mhm.
so you can go online and look up these communities. Most of them have open discords and channels and stuff like that. And you can really see, people just saying, so today I did this experiment, this is what I got, what do you think? And people give feedback. And some of them are really experts, so they're like, oh, have you thought of this thing, and maybe you should improve it by doing this and that. So it's really as if, you have this massive community of people that's helping you out. And you can talk to them at any time. It's really fun.
Oh, that's cool. I'll check it. I mean, I'll take a closer look because I saw this terminal coming up when I was preparing the recording. So I'm glad you explained to me what it is and yeah, how it actually relates to potentially healthcare research.
But
Okay.
also back to the point of earlier, we did not say the word blockchain once. We talked about science and community. We did not talk about the technology. So if this weren't a blockchain interview, we could talk about decentralized science without ever knowing what's the technology behind it. And I think that's really amazing, because that means that we found a use case that brings value and no one
Yeah,
cares about the technology.
yeah. That would be then I guess the message for the episode. No, that's good. Okay, I'm keeping an eye on the time, and I still have a couple of recurring questions to ask you. So you obviously very knowledgeable about the field that we talked about. So Web3, blockchain, decentralized science, and yeah, all of these topics related to healthcare. I think you also do a lot of content production work in that regard. What resources would you recommend us to look at to learn more about all these things, be it books publications, websites?
So I think that, well, first of all, allow me to do a bit of self promotion and encourage people to listen to my podcast, because it's filled with resources. So, Tech Anatomy, that is, if you're looking for anything related to Web3 and AI in healthcare. What I really like to do is also, and this is very counterintuitive, but actually look at the research and the science. You do have a lot of very interesting papers that are published. I do like to take a look at IEEE Spectrum website. They publish a lot of things. So it's not necessarily Web3 related, but it's just
Yeah.
technology in general, and electronics and informatics and things like that. If you're really like a geek like I am, and you really like looking into these things, I think that's amazing. Like, I spend hours reading all the other articles and things like that. I think it's really, you can go down the rabbit hole on that website. So I encourage you to look at that. Um, if you're interested in anything also AI related, I would suggest you look up someone who's called Ali K. Miller. She's one of the thought leaders in the AI space. She does a lot of content on LinkedIn. She has a newsletter that's really great that keeps you up to date on anything like that. So that's really cool. Then, if you're looking into DeSci, I encourage you to follow Molecule, which is a company that's in this space, one of the founders of the DeSci movement, and they have a lot of great resources as well and a newsletter. And then, with anything blockchain related, ugh, I don't really know where to get the information anymore. You have the classical news about the crypto world and so on, but blockchain in healthcare lately, there's not a lot going on, so I don't have very good resources for that.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned already plenty of them, and I'll put all of them in the show notes so that people can easily find the related resources. The second question around, an anecdote from your work that made you realize the impact that you were having on people's lives. Like usually, I ask kids in the sense where people have direct interactions, to patients, or they're working on technology that is patient facing. In your case, I guess the impact is more like on the health tech ecosystem and maybe more like on industrial actors. But yeah, so I'll still thought, I'd ask you the question as well.
Well, I think that the work we're doing on my podcast, but also at the agency as a whole, where we create a lot of podcasts for others, we're so proud when we help healthcare people that don't know a lot about technology, have those aha moments. I think that's something that's so gratifying when, you know, these technologies have this buzz effect where everyone talks about them, but not a lot of people actually understand what they are. And so something happens where after a while, a lot of people won't admit that they don't understand because they feel like, they're going to be judged. I mean, this thing has been going on for years now. Like, I cannot say that I don't understand. And I think the whole thing that we're doing with the podcast and all the other tech communities that we're doing is help healthcare people really understand technology and feel at ease with technology, understand what decentralized ledger is, understand what machine learning is in very, very simple terms. And this is something that we're incredibly proud of is when we see. So, for instance, we worked with a client, and at the beginning, we had a handful of people who were interested in AI. And the goal was to have 100+ people in the company interested. But they were very scared. And we ended up reaching those 100+ people through storytelling, through gamification, through content. And so this is what we're really proud of is how do we use these technologies and these ways of telling stories to engage people and bring them into the tech conversation, take us with us into the rabbit hole, into the geek world, and share a good time. And I think that's really, really amazing part of our job.
Yeah, and there's a big education aspect as well. So I think,
Yeah.
yeah, we benefit a lot from it. So thank you for doing all that work. You already mentioned it, but maybe you will mention someone else. So if you would recommend, a fellow healthcare innovator as a potential guest for the podcast, who would that be? And where would you recommend her or him?
So I think you should talk to Jim Nasser. As I said, he's amazing. I've known him for 8 years now. He's probably one of the first people when he was still working at the CDC who reached out and he was like, I see you're talking about blockchain. I'm really interested in that as well. Let's connect. And ever since, I see him, I think, every year in the Nordics because we attend the same conference up there. So I see him once a year, and it's always great to connect. He is incredibly knowledgeable about these topics. He is one of the very few people that I know who actually understands the value proposition of blockchain and decentralized ledger technologies, that actually uses these technologies and is not just talking about them, and who can actually testify to the value that it can bring. And so, if you want to understand this and the intersection with I strongly recommend inviting him on the show. I can connect you with him.
Super. Then we'll have to consider him then, I guess. If not this season, maybe the next one. But yeah, if you can put us in touch, that would be great.
Of course.
Anca, thank you so much. I think it was a very, interesting episode. I mean, I say that to every episode, but I thought you had a lot of, honesty and yeah, it was good to hear that, what that the use cases that we talked about like 2, 3 years ago are still, valid, that, the value proposition of that technology didn't change, but it's also good to have that sort of like reality check in terms of where things stand and how much it's actually being used. And I'm glad we touched on the decentralized science topic because yeah, I really didn't know about that like 2 years ago, 2 days ago. So yeah, I hope people will have learned something new. And again, thank you for all the work you do in the space and all the content you produce. I think it's helping a lot of people.
Well, I think that I can say the same thing back because I'm a big fan of the podcast. We've worked together on the podcast. So thank you for spreading the word and also contribute to educating people around technology and all the amazing medical devices and projects that you highlight. It's really a great pleasure to listen to your episodes each time. So thank you so much for having me.
Thank you, Anka. Thanks for watching the episode. I hope you enjoyed it. You can subscribe by clicking on the podcast channel at the top right and watch another episode here at the bottom.